Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and I'm super pleased to have in the studio with me Professor Sophia McLennen, the director of the Center for Global Studies, the associate director of the School of International Affairs, professor of International Affairs and Comparative Literature at Pennsylvania State University, the author of Colbert's America, and the co-author of Is Satire Saving Our Nation, and a contributor to Salon. You're a little bit of an overachiever here, Sophia. Welcome. It's our super achiever.
Glad to be here.
And your website is Sophia MCCLENNEN, SophiaMcLennen.com, and you can tweet her at McLennan65. So, political satire makes us smarter news consumers? How?
Well, one of the ways it does, it changes sort of how we consume news is that it uses irony, right? And so one of the key pieces of satire is that you don't really say what you mean. So the brain has to process that. You say, if it's raining, you say, wow, what great weather. And I know you're being sarcastic, you're being ironic. And when I process that, my brain has to light up. It's very interesting to look at what happens to the mind when it processes satire. Meanwhile, most news is based on sort of a sensationalist, fear-based, emotive mode. And that is the reverse, right? It kind of shuts down your critical thinking. So in a news cycle, in a sort of news world like we're living in, satire is becoming incredibly important to help keep our minds nimble.
Yeah. And that idea of how we process things, there's a thing in NLP that you can't process a negative. That in order to process a negative, you first have to conceptualize the positive. And so if you say to somebody, don't run out in front of the traffic, the first thing they have to do is imagine running out in front of the traffic, which in many cases actually increases the probability that they will do it, if not now, at the future. In fact, it's taken as a command. And so there's like all these subtle levels of how we process communication. The other thing about comedy, I took a Bob McKee seminar years ago on screenwriting and novel writing, and he said the main thing about comedy is the moment of the unexpected moment. That I just got in from St. Louis. Boy, are my legs or boy, are my arms tired. That's the breaking of expectation, as it were. How does that work?
Well, it's exactly what you just said, right? So it's forcing the brain to think outside of the literal meaning of what they thought you were going to say, right? Which was you flew in on a plane.
Right.
And so that helps you because you're filling in gaps in creative and rational and exciting ways. It does some fun things because you're enjoying yourself. And that's always good too for the brain because it's not fear-based. I just did a review of Bassem Youssef's new book, Revolution for Dummies. He was considered the Egyptian Jon Stewart. And one of the things that Bassem Youssef says is, when you're laughing, you can't be afraid.
Well, that's interesting.
And so this is taken from someone who had, gone through some extraordinary turmoil in Egypt and telling the public how his show, which reached about 40 million viewers, helped the public sort of navigate what was happening politically, right?
Now, there's a story that I learned in high school, which was a long time ago, that I don't to this day know if it was apocryphal or not, but it was about court jesters. And the story was that in kingdoms of old, that nobody wanted to contradict the king and nobody wanted to tell the king the truth. But somebody had to be able to, and the kings or queens, more typically kings, realized this. And so they would designate one person or one small group of people who could say literally anything and not lose their heads. And they were referred to as the jesters, so that whatever they said could be taken seriously or not at the choice of the king. And that this was sort of an origin point for a lot of what we call comedy and satire now, at least as a structural component of our culture. Is that stuff true?
It's absolutely true. And one of the sort of fascinating things, if you're a satire geek like I am, is that you find that satire emerges in moments of crisis. So when there is sort of an authoritarian crisis, when there's political breakdown, satire emerges in great force. And that's one of the reasons why we have so much of it today. One of the measures of the sort of strength of a leader is whether or not a leader will be able to handle comedy and satire. And so when Donald Trump started having hissy fits about Alec Baldwin's impersonation on SNL, it was interesting and it was historic because in the past, there's an interesting history of impersonations and how presidents have handled the jokes, right? You might remember Chevy Chase impersonating Gerald Ford and always walking into stuff.
I remember well.
And often the presidents say, hey, that's pretty funny. You know, you did a good job, right? Certainly Obama had to handle quite a bit of it. The fact that Trump seems to be so thin-skinned has been also a sign in the comedy world, right? That there is a line and he's not comfortable with it.
Well, and not just there is a line, but there's also almost a metric of insanity is not the right word, tyranny. I mean, it was in 1933, I'm pretty sure. It's been a while since I read Shearer's book, but I've been rereading it, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, that Hitler started executing comedians in the 30s. And satirists. I mean, there's a point where that was just viewed as, you know, anti-regime propaganda. I haven't heard about anybody being executed, but you know, there's a lot of ways to take people out in this society. Deny them employment, you know, go after them. Nixon went after people with the IRS, things like that. What should we be alarmed? Is there something we should be looking for here?
We do want to always keep an eye on it because it's directly related to our kind of free speech First Amendment rights. So we start to see that being encroached on in the world of comedy in the same ways that we see it in the news media. Remember that after 9/11, Bill Maher lost his job, right? Because
over a joke.
Over a joke. Well,
it was not. I mean, it was one of those things where
one of those moments.
He said the 9/11 guys were not cowards.
You could call them anything.
Yeah,
just not a coward.
Right. He said they were willing to give up their lives for what they believed in, or something, words to that effect, which arguably is true.
And he had to get off the air, right, and adjust. At the same time, we saw this happening with professors, with reporters, pressure, not getting your contract renewed, things like that. So it's important to understand that in our own history, we don't tend to execute the comedians. We just shut them down and silence them in different ways. So we want to keep an eye on that for sure.
So what is the state of things right now? It seems like the comedians, particularly as they're getting more and more political, Stephen Colbert and you know, a number of these guys who have, I've been just reading stories in the entertainment press about how the more political they go on their shows, mostly anti-Trump political, the better their ratings are. So it seems like it's a good environment right now for comedians.
That's true. And that's because we're living in this sort of corporate land, right? So as long as I'm doing well and I'm getting viewers, in fact, Colbert's got the highest ratings he's ever had, right, on The Late Show. Trevor Noah also is getting his highest ratings because he's sort of cutting his teeth and, you know, doing sharper satire. And so you're right. You hit the nail on the head. How could Stewart and Colbert get away with some of the things they did? We go back and maybe some of your listeners remember the Smothers Brothers. I mean, they couldn't stay on.
Yeah,
right?
CBS kicked them off eventually
because they also had to get all of their bits pre-screened.
Right, and half of what they were doing, half of the anti-war stuff they were doing like it was buried 3 levels deep. You knew what they were saying, but they were not saying it.
Exactly. And so if you look at what Stewart and Colbert got away with during the George W. years, it's astonishing. So we have seen a kind of liberalization of what you can do in the land of comedy. And as long as you're not upsetting your sponsors and as long as you're continuing to get viewers, it seems to be holding. But again, the fact that Trump was saying SNL is bad, Baldwin is terrible, the idea that our own, at the time also, right, elected president would do that is interesting, right? Because it did suggest that he was hoping to put pressure on that show.
Well, it's also a dog whistle to the brown shirts, essentially, to his followers. You know, it's the level of attack that comes at you can get pretty amazing, and yeah, really amazing. And I'm hopeful that these guys can make it through. Any suggestions on using satire to diffuse intense political situations? You know, it's Thanksgiving dinner and crazy Uncle Ralph is sitting at the table talking about how much he loves Donald Trump, and you just want to say something.
Yeah, okay, so that's a very interesting point because it turns out that satire goes over extremely badly
Uh-huh.
when you're dealing with somebody who's sensitive, right?
Huh.
So one of the things that I'm actually currently doing research on is what I call blowback, right? When the joke, when you don't get the joke, when you feel like the butt of the joke, right? And so I'm trying to gather, well, we have the story, Bassem Youssef is exiled effectively from Egypt. I have a story of a Colombian satirist who was murdered. We have the Danish cartoonists that were also murdered. I mean, when does it cross that Charlie Hebdo, right? What happens when people become viciously angry because they feel mocked, right? So satire in its best form is encouraging critical thinking and not just making someone look stupid. That's not really it.
Right.
But again, if you feel like you've been humiliated, the anger that comes out of that can be far worse than other modes of communication.
Right.
So that's one of the things.
Humiliation and powerlessness are the two principal sources of rage, I believe.
Right. And so if you look at sort of the personality of somebody who's an authoritarian or even a terrorist, right, it's a fear-driven, paranoia-driven, anxiety-driven. So the satirist is the other side, right? The comedy, the laughing, the reason. And those parts of the brain don't usually talk to each other in the same way. So I can be an energizing sort of a collective resistance at the same time that I'm really angering those people that feel like they're the target.
Right. As long as they're not sitting around the Thanksgiving table with you.
Yeah. I mean, mostly I think you should talk about the weather at Thanksgiving.
That's probably, that's wise advice. Political satire, the article, Why Political Satire Makes Us Smarter News Consumers, that was published where?
That was on Vox. This Vox video.
VOX.
Yeah.
VOX, not F. FR. Yeah, there we go. Professor Sophia McLennen, Director of the Center for Global Studies, Associate Director of the School for International Affairs, and you can, her website's sophiamclennen.com. You can tweet her at McLennan65. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.